where a pair of wooden cases open up the world of telecommunications.
Got two wooden boxes with glass tops, and there appears to be inside some form of cables, which are telegraph cables for across both the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean. I remember them being at my grandmother's house in her front room. There's a keyhole here, and I think they were locked when we were very small. And we used to sort of be quite fascinated by what they were, because we couldn't actually get into them, or weren't allowed to get into them. Later on, we were allowed to have a look at them. She used to tell us about that our great-grandfather was a diver, and that he'd put these cables in across the Atlantic, and then it was left to your own imagination what you thought he'd got up to, etc. But we're assuming that that's how these came into his possession. I'd like to know a little bit of history of them, and if we could find out how they did come into his possession, or into the family's possession, and whether he was a diver.
The plaques engraved on the two presentation boxes detail the late 19th century underwater telegraph projects in which these cables had been involved. One from the southeast of Africa up to Aden in Yemen, and the other crossing the Atlantic from Senegal to South America. With submarine telecommunications still being very relevant today, our first port of call was Porthcurno in Cornwall, which remains a major terminal for the telegraph system.
And one of the big technologies of the 19th century was communications. The first international telecommunications cable was laid in 1850 from Dover to Calais. That's obviously quite a short cable. Finally, in the 1860s, they laid a cable across the North Atlantic. From that date, cables were laid more and more around the world. So by 1872, there was a network linking UK with the Far East. And then again, from the 1870s through into the early part of the 20th century, cables were being laid for the first time around other parts of the British Empire. This included Africa. This was really the Victorian equivalent of the Apollo project, massively exciting. Submarine telegraph cable is made up of lots of layers of materials. At the core, at the heart of it, is the copper wire, and this is the only part of the cable that actually conducts a signal. So obviously, put a copper wire with electricity underwater, you have an explosion unless it's properly insulated. So the gutta percha surrounds the copper wire, which is a natural product, and it was discovered in the 1840s that this was a suitable material to insulate the copper wires. And then you have layers of jute, tarred jute, to provide packing and more waterproofing, and steel wires, maybe one layer, maybe two layers, to protect the cable. For shallow water cable, they needed a thicker and stronger cable, so that's the one which is heavily armoured and about 2 inches in diameter. For deep water, where there weren't anchors and there weren't sharks, etc., to actually damage the cable, it was more like 1 inch in diameter and may only have one layer of armouring.
So it was case closed on the cables. But what about the man William Saunders, who supposedly worked in laying them? Tony Harris is an ex-professional diver with first-hand experience of laying sea cables.
The Atlantic's quite a deep piece of water, and diving technology, even nowadays, you can't go down that deep as a diver. They can only work really to about 150 foot. Their main jobs really would be for the laying down the final piece of the cable, and also obviously to help if it got snagged on the side of the ship. They didn't really know too much about decompression thickness, the bends. So if they were diving too deep and for too long, they could obviously get bent. Then you've got all your common type diving related problems, i.e. getting fouled, snagged, severed air supplies, that kind of thing.
So what exactly was the role of Dennis's great-grandfather in this perilous operation? Perhaps the cable company's records would hold the answer.
One of the cables concerned was laid by the Eastern and South African Telegraph Company. So we went to look at the staff records for that company, and unfortunately he wasn't there. But the fact he's a diver was interesting, and although divers wouldn't normally be part of the cable laying team per se, if he had these skills, he may well have been brought in by the cable company in particular circumstances.
So despite not being listed, he could still have been a member of the team. William's travels overseas gave Dennis further proof of his involvement.
Interestingly, he also was in Newfoundland in 1894, and a cable was laid around that time to Newfoundland, so he has got a lot of cable connections.
William had the connections, but how could he have picked up the skills? We knew he had served in the Army's Royal Engineers. We checked the regiment's service papers at the Public Records Office at Kew. William Saunders was listed, but not as a diver. He was an engine driver. Disheartening news, but not to those who know the history of the Royal Engineers.
They did quite a few jobs clearing Navy ships that had crashed in places like Portsmouth Harbour, the Thames, around Chatham. And the Navy eventually went to the Army and said, you know, can you teach our seamen to dive? So they sent a Lance Corporal Nichols to teach them. So it was a Lance Corporal Nichols taught the Navy to dive.
Even if William Saunders had not been an actual diver, with his Royal Engineers background, he would certainly have the relevant skills to assist in underwater cable projects. Were the sections of cable kept for any special reason?
He would have had it as a memento. I've worked on cable laying jobs in the past, and there's always a little bit left over, so it's nice to think, well, we've laid 3,000 miles of that, and I've got a few inches of it as a keepsake. You know, it's nice to show your kids. So it would purely have been as a memento.
And it seems that this memento was not only seen by William's children, but also his grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
It bears out some of the things that we were told by my grandmother, which is nice, because I was a bit concerned that it was going to be a little bit, that most of it was just myth. I can't see me ever taking up diving. I'm a bit old to start with, but I'm definitely a landman. The thought of going deep down into the sea doesn't appeal to me at all.